Well, we got a new batch of the Twitter files this morning at about 9 a.m., and surprise, surprise, it turns out that the regime was also using their agent, Twitter, to censor any valid information about the Wu flu, commonly known as COVID-19, and the jabs, the jabs that we're all supposed to take, that contradicted their narrative. Doesn't matter, even if you showed their own data, they were going to slap you down and they were going to shut you down. And in fact, the new Twitter files show that the Biden administration in particular was just furious that Twitter wasn't censoring people fast enough, and that they were getting very impatient, and that there were too many dissident doctors on the platform. So the gist of what happened is the regime wanted to promote a narrative of fear, sickness, and death. Remember the dark winter arc of Joe Biden's presidency? That's what Twitter was supposed to defend, uphold, and advance. They were the revolutionary vanguard of Wu flu hysteria and vaccine maximalism. Anything that even downplayed either the intensity of the virus or the efficacy of the vaccines was unilaterally declared to be false, factually incorrect, regardless of whether or not the statements made in the form of tweets had any false information in them at all. One example that I find particularly striking is a tweet from when Trump was released from Walter Reed Hospital back in, October of 2020, after he had the Wu flu right before the election. And he said, you know what, I'm feeling fine. We got great medicine that we worked at. If you remember, Trump was given monoclonal antibodies. He said, we've developed, great medicine for this illness, and, you shouldn't be afraid of it. And so it was just very inoffensive. He didn't make any factual claims even. He just said, you know what, I had this, I got over it, I'm feeling better, let's be hopeful. And Jim Baker, the top FBI stooge at Twitter, former Twitter general counsel who was only fired recently by Elon Musk, was furious that the system had not already taken down Trump's tweet. He said he was begging, asking his fellow staff, how is this not a violation of our disinformation policy? Trump is saying, you shouldn't be afraid. Our policy is that everyone should be very, very afraid. And so it took a lot of convincing and vetoing from people above Jim Baker to keep that tweet online. Even something as mild as that is saying, you know what, we got some medicine for this now, let's just not be afraid. No, Twitter, at least a substantial contingent of Twitter, went so far as to say, no, you need to be afraid. You need to be very afraid. And then also we saw plenty of examples of doctors, which we can all think of them. Peter McCullough comes to mind first, and then you have Robert Malone. But then the Twitter files were showing other guys. They didn't specifically mention McCullough and Malone, though. I mean, we can certainly surmise that they were caught up in all this. They showed Martin Kulldorff getting censored, and another doctor from Rhode Island, I believe. So Martin Kulldorff is, I believe, a Harvard professor of public health, and he disagreed with the public health authorities. So you've got, this isn't just, some random guy on Twitter saying, you know what, I think I disagree with the regime. That's egregious enough, censoring just a normal, ordinary citizen. But no, you have a Harvard doctor, a professor at Harvard Medical School saying, you know what, I don't think that the regime is making a great case here. I think that there is another side to this issue. And Twitter decided, no, unilaterally, there is no other side to this issue. Sorry, Harvard medical expert. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know how to practice medicine. And so they, of course, suspended his account. And then there was an Anon account that they showed that cited CDC data verbatim. They just took data from the CDC website, put it in a tweet, and that was flagged as misinformation. Why? Because the data didn't support the narrative that the CDC was putting out. So it doesn't matter what the actual data is. What is truth is the narrative. The CDC can put out the subjective data, but that doesn't mean anything. You have to wait for the CDC to tell you what the conclusion is. And it doesn't matter if the conclusions drawn by the CDC completely contradict the data. It is the narrative that is true. You don't craft the narrative to fit the data. You craft the data to fit the narrative. Any data that doesn't support the narrative needs to be censored. And so this also was the case when it came to the jabs, as we all know. I think that the censorship actually got worse once the jabs came along, if you could believe that or not. They didn't talk too much about the jabs in these Twitter files, but we certainly can surmise, based on everything else that was going on. Heck, even, the Trump administration wanted to get in on the censorship of dissidents during their tenure, presiding over the Wu flu pandemic. But think of how many lives have been lost, and how many people have just been living under a rock, scared to death to go outside for years now because of the actual misinformation that was pushed by the regime and propagated by Twitter. And the fact that they did not allow any counterpoints because they knew that they were so wrong that if they allowed anyone to present a dissident opinion out in the open, that they would obviously win the argument. Perhaps there would have been people who maybe were more willing to go outside if it weren't for all of the censorship of hope, if it weren't for the maximalization of the fear-mongering. And maybe there would have been less people who were so depressed because they were locked inside their house, in a prison partially of their own making. Perhaps they wouldn't have taken their own lives. Perhaps there would have been less suicide. And furthermore, once the jabs came out, and a lot of the hysterics, most of the hysterics I would hope, came out from under their shell, although there certainly are plenty that are still, hiding under a rock. People, as we know, have been suffering complications in the wake of taking their jabs. That's what I'll leave it at. I still don't think that we're allowed to say anything about it on YouTube, so I'll leave it at that. But you know what I'm talking about fully well. We know what happened to Scott Minerd, God rest his soul, the poor executive at Guggenheim who had pretty decent takes on financial matters. He died suddenly along with so many others. Perhaps if more folks knew about that, less people might have undertaken such a procedure, and therefore less people, because if there's a certain percentage of them that suffer fatal complications, if less people took it, then less people then would be exposed to that and less likely to suffer those same complications, if you get my meaning. Suffice it to say, the actions taken by Twitter and other social media platforms to act as the revolutionary vanguard of the regime's narrative cost an untold number of people their lives. Joe Biden said that the free speech of people on these platforms was literally the social media companies, by allowing certain people to speak, by not censoring enough, that they were literally killing people. It's quite the opposite, Joe. By not allowing people to present a dissenting point of view against your obviously incorrect narrative is what really costs lives, because it gives people no alternative. They're not allowed to make their own decisions. If people presented with all the information, people will generally make the right choice. But the vast majority of Americans simply were not given that opportunity. They weren't given the option to weigh their odds. And so I wish that the Twitter files could make enough of a cultural impact to really make a difference moving forward. But sadly, I think most people will just happily go back to sleep. So with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow. I hope you all had a Merry Christmas. So I'll leave it off there.